Yeah, hi. So first of all, thanks a lot for all the talks. It was definitely very interesting. I have a couple of specific questions about the segmentation masks. I was saving them. So first of all, towards the end, you showed the performance, and it seemed like performance was going. There we go. Depended on whether it was the same speaker, same gender, or different gender. And so,
which slide?
It was further forward. It was towards the end.
Keep going.
Yeah, it's like a graph with 3 lines.
Yeah. Yep.
So, yeah, that one. So, I mean, the first thing I think, what's different between these types of speakers is the timbre of the voice. I mean, but if the same talker will obviously sound the most similar to themselves. And so the question is, have you thought about incorporating any timbre-related features, or do you know of any, let's say, grouping rules that could take advantage of timbre information in order to improve the masks to separate the sources when they sound similar? That's the first question.
That's a good question. I mean, it's not just the timbre, it's also the F0. So I think, I mean, the same speaker has the same similar pitch possibly as well. So there's 2 things going on there. There's the pitch confusions, but yeah, obviously the timbre as well. I mean, one of the things the listeners do in this task is they keyword spot, and they keyword spot the word white, and therefore build a kind of model for what the timbre of that speaker might sound like, and therefore then don't necessarily sequentially track through to the letter and digit, but hold in their head what that speaker should sound like, and then do a kind of speech recognition sort of attention task at the end to try and retrieve that speaker. Now, if it's going to be the same speaker, they can't do that, so they get very confused. So, I mean, that data is the human performance. So when it's the same speaker, I mean, the listeners are doing really poorly at -3, 0 dB. Where it's kind of 50%, that's possibly because half the time they're just picking out the wrong. They're still hearing the 2 words in the letter and digit, but they're picking out what was meant to be, the masker rather than the target. And the only way to distinguish the 2 is if you've managed to somehow track the utterance right through from the word white. Now, the only key you've got for doing that maybe is the continuity of the pitch contour. But that's kind of gone as well. So I don't think it's necessarily a timbre issue per se. I think it's more this kind of...
Maybe, so when you have this problem of the F0 being around the same area, maybe there is when you can try and use timbre.
I guess when it's the same gender and different, same gender conditioning, that's slightly different because there the pitch tracks might be confusing, but then you have got some speaker differences which you can pick up on. And listeners seem to be able to use that better than some of our models are able to use. So yeah, and I think one of the big problems here is then just if you look at kind of acoustic models that use in speech, they're generally pretty poor, and they don't, accents and things aren't modelled as well as they should be in speech models. So our systems are using speaker-dependent models, but they're not picking up on all the subtleties of a speaker's accent, which a listener would be able to exploit. So it's partly a kind of paucity in the actual acoustic models being used in the system, which kind of so it's timbre, but it's all sorts of other things as well, which would distinguish the speaker.
Okay, thanks. Just another very short question. The other thing, at the beginning you mentioned that one consideration is how do these systems scale when you have more than 2 sources, if you have 2 or 3 or 4 sources, but I'm not sure that was touched upon really. I mean, my question is, how would this approach generalize if you wanted to separate 3 rather than 2?
Right. So my point here is that the task really never is to separate 3 at the same time. If you're going to separate 3, what you might do is you might listen sequentially to it several times over, and each time plug in a different model for the target. So I mean, my approach here would be to first of all you plug in the target model, you listen to the thing, it comes out with the target utterance. Then you plug in a model for the masker speaker, listen to the thing, and it comes out the masker utterance. And I think this is kind of what listeners do. You'll either attend to the male speaker, or you can say attend to the female speaker. You don't attend to 2 simultaneously. So then the point is then, the actual decoding stage doesn't depend on the number of sources there. It depends on the kind of number of fragments, if you like. So you've got the target model and you've got a bunch of fragments. As long as the number of fragments is quite small, the complexity doesn't really grow. Now, I mean, in more complicated scenes you might get more fragments, but in general, that's not the case. I mean, there's a fairly consistent number of fragments coming out even in complicated scenes because, just from the statistics of speech and sparsity. So, whereas the model combination approach, you're then searching over, that doesn't scale so well, and you've got to then do things to start pruning and doing things to try and cope with the complexity, because you're searching over bigger and bigger search spaces, trying to find exhaustive, complete description of the whole scene.
So that would be going a bit against what we're seeing recently in approaches which try to do source separation and separate everything at the same time. I mean, that's quite, let's say, a hot topic in music technology areas recently. And so what you're saying, that this would be going quite against what, let's say, humans are actually doing.
I don't know what humans are doing. I mean, it's taking a very strong view. I mean, it's taking a strong view.
It's a non-CASA approach, let's put it that way.
I'm taking the view that humans are doing something like this. I don't know they are. I mean, I'd need to kind of support that with more kind of listening tests. But I'm saying it's more likely humans are doing something like this than they are separating out simultaneously sources of every single source in the environment and then doing recognition afterwards. I mean, I see it more as a kind of, they've got some idea of what masking is and some models for segmentation, which you've got to perform, but being directed by the idea of a target and then a kind of background for which you don't actually care too much about. And your model of the background, so it's kind of asymmetry. Your model of the background might be much, much simpler than your model of the foreground. And this is a very kind of extreme view maybe, and maybe we're doing this just to kind of push the boundaries of what you can do without a background model, but I think what we want to do next is to start introducing more and more knowledge about the background into this framework without kind of breaking the central tenets of the framework.
And I think that it links what Boris was saying is about survival, which is basically being able to focus on something which is weird, happening, that can be harmful, and then forget about the rest. And we've been discussing that this morning, and there seems to be quite a lot of evidence that it's really hard to concentrate on two different things happening at the same time, which have different features.
Thanks also for this presentation. My question is rather general. You showed us the performance of these different segmentation algorithms. I would be interested whether all these rely on similar time frequency representation, because I mean that's obviously an important step to separate the different components.
A large number of them rely on pitch tracking, so that's a kind of fairly consistent thing that was used throughout. But I don't know about, there's a kind of difference in the kind of, the difficulty we have is kind of the acoustic modelling that we have to do in the kind of spectral domain. So we have the models which kind of model how sounds combine and mask each other in the spectral domain. It's quite hard for us to then, whereas speech recognition, large vocabulary speech recognition is normally done in kind of capsular domain. You decorrelate the features. And the kind of missing data approaches we use don't easily map into these kind of decorrelated feature domains. So we have a kind of, if you look at our results, we often do quite well in extreme noise conditions, but we do very poorly in the clean conditions where there isn't any background noise. So when the full signal's available, we're not able to model it or to do as well as we should be doing. So that's one of the issues. So a lot of them start off in looking at time frequency representations. But I mean, ideally you want to kind of do your acoustic modelling in some decorrelated feature space.
Okay, this question is primarily directed to the last two speakers. I mean, you sort of touched on this, but I mean, what do you see as the proper role of meta-information? In the real world, we usually know where we are, and of course, we form expectations about what might occur given a situation. I mean, we can't help but do that, and that certainly seems to be reasonable to build in a model. I mean, especially for something like Boris's models, where what's important to monitor for things that might be unexpected in a given situation. But, of course, then you don't want to, jury rig your model. So I'm wondering how you see that balance between, how much prior information do you want to build into these things. Because it's very powerful, like if you're listening to speakers, knowing how many speakers are in a room can really help you, and what gender they are and things like that.
Well, so in my point of view, I mean, again, yeah, I mean, this is why I kind of backed off from this kind of idea of, I think I was given the title of probabilistic scene understanding. I mean, and I don't want to touch on understanding because I think that there's a high level cognitive layer which is seeing what the task is in the first place, and and the kind of models of attention, kind of bottom up and top down attention, where the actual task is obviously you might have some idea about what the task is, but that might be driven from the environment itself. So if you know there's 5 speakers in the room, you might know that you've got to be switching tension between them. I think the model I was kind of presenting kind of stops at the point of that layer, and there's something needs to be sitting on top in order to cope with kind of prior expectations. I don't think necessarily the prior expectations. Again, it's a question about the background and how much needs to be known about the background. Because if I'm listening to you in this environment, or if I'm listening to you in a different environment, it might be the same grouping processes are going on regardless, and they might not be influenced very much by the environment. Those things might be quite independent. So I guess one of the things we're trying to achieve is this kind of factorizing the problem into bits which are independent of noise sources and environments, and bits which are dependent on the environment.
That's kind of unrealistic, isn't it? Given the way we operate in the real world.
I don't know, because it simplifies the problem a long way. And it seems to me that these kind of grouping rules, which precisely so like in our model, so we have a pitch tracking element which tracks the pitch, which finds the fragments in the first place. Now, we try to be independent of the noise environment, but there's parameters in there which we tune. We cheat in a way. We kind of make assumptions in there which aren't meant to be in there. But that part of the model is kind of more robust, if you like, to false assumptions than other parts are. So if you can factorize things out, you might find that some bits are less dependent on. I'm not answering the question. I'm avoiding the question. But
well, it's not an answer. I'm just wondering what you both saw as the proper balance there, between how much meta information to build into such a model. So it'd be interesting to see what Boris says about that.
It depends how much you've got as well. Because in some situations you have an awful lot of knowledge, and then you want to be able to use it. So in a speech separation task, there's 2 speakers, and you've got, potentially you've got access to models of all the speakers, and then you could do an exhaustive thing. But then listeners don't have that information all the time.
I'm not sure I get your question, but in my point of view, I would say that the context information would be something we need to add, because like for instance, what is happening before an aggression, that there is the voice are coming, or there is something with falling down, so and like what is happening after also. So this information we don't use them now. We only use the information at a moment, and I'm sure we can give a better performance to the system if we have this kind of context information, and also if we could separate the sound, because our system is very basic. We just analyze the stream without demixing, and like if we could separate an event from the background, or 2 events, it will be much easier to detect. So from my point of view, the background noise is a real problem, and we need to detect the sound. We have to detect it has to emerge from the background noise, like from 10 dB. And so we cannot make a performance which match the hearing system, you know. So there's a lot of improvement to make using the CASA results.
Well, like sometimes you can detect things that are lower than the background sound, like in the example he gave. An example he gave about the speakers that were actually the performance, you know, got worse as the SNR was increased, right? Because they were listening for things are quiet. So I mean, like, you know, context can help you actually detect things that you wouldn't be able to detect otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah, but those was result for humans, and I'm pretty sure that if you lower down the target signal, like a supervised approach, like based on GMN and features, will miserably fail. Yeah.
I mean, I think context is very important because, I mean, we've been doing kind of speech recognition in these noise environments recorded in family homes. So you've got this kind of recording done in a family sitting room over 20, 30 hours, and speech is being mixed into the signal. And it's noisy, but the thing is, the kind of scope of noises that can happen is actually quite limited. It's a domain. You know, there are certain sounds like televisions and doors that close and open, which are specific to that domain. And if you move to another room, you get a different library, if you like, of noises. And if you had some higher level kind of process which informs you about where you are, even in the house, I mean, that could give you prior assumptions which can load in your library of models, which you can then use to improve your performance. So yeah, sure, the context is massively important, but how that's actually built into the models is, you know, and how humans use that information is, yeah, an open question, I suppose.
But I can just say one thing actually, which is that certainly in texture recognition, context can actually be pretty important, and that's because you can have very different things in the world that end up creating a signal that's fairly similar, like applause and rain, for instance, right? If you have rain falling on an appropriate surface, it'll sound a lot like applause. And you know, if you show people this room versus show them outdoors, you know, they'll hear different things.
Guys, they use
Absolutely, yeah. No, those are great examples, yeah. Yeah. So I mean, we don't really understand exactly how that works, but it's clear that people take a lot of advantage of that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, obviously in speech processing, I mean, if you take a little bit of speech out of context, I mean, phonemes overlap. I mean, so it's only in the context that they actually make any sense at all.
I have a question here.
I have 2 questions for the last presentation. So it's concerning the context of your application. The first question is you're very concerned about your false alarm. But I feel that I'm more concerned if you miss detecting something. Because if something wrong happened, we didn't detect, so I'm not sure if your system recall 100% the problematic things. And the second question is, many things happen, and then we got the sound, which means when we get the audio, it's already too late. Something bad has already happened. Except for the machine, of course. Machine, you can say the starts going wrong, we can stop it automatically. But for the human, like monitoring the whole society, you got a screen, maybe something wrong has already happened, and it's too late to do something. So I wonder what's the application of this.
Well, the thing is that most of the people are when they are doing this kind of bad thing, let's say, they think that they are not under surveillance. And if you are able to fire an alarm, I'm pretty sure that the first thing that the guy will do is start to run. This is the end of the aggression. That's my perspective. And if a system is able to detect with no errors and fire a signal or whatever saying that something's wrong is happening, I think this could work. I haven't read any study for that, but maybe I'm wrong.
For the first question, we can make the sound signature we can train it in order to detect to have very good result on detecting the target source. Is what we do. We train it in order to detect most and so we just have to deal with the fast errors, and it's easy to train the model in order to have a better result on detecting target class and for the second question, it's you're right. When the system is detecting an aggression immediately, and so the police can go and react immediately, and or the guy is turning the camera in order to have the image of the aggression, for instance. So it has an effect, and yeah.
And also for emergency, because if the aggression has been done, then there's probably someone lying on the floor, and if you're fast enough, you can save him. This means that, for example, in France, we have an average response time of 12 minutes. If the guy spent 2 hours lying on the floor at the night, I'm pretty sure, if he could recover, he will, but you might miss something too. Like even if we don't catch the guy, that might be helpful, in my opinion.
Thanks. So, Mathieu, this is actually a question for you. So, at the beginning of your introduction talk, you made a quite important, I think, accusation, saying that a lot of people, say that they use CASA-inspired ideas for their algorithms, but they don't really go into it in much depth. And I think I'd be happy to admit that I'm probably one of these people. I mean, I come from MIR. And so, I mean, we've seen examples in the first talks about how people, serious attempts to model parts of, of human perception. But my question is for the greedier MIR people that, we want to use these ideas to then get a final goal, like melody extraction or genre classification, or, we have these very specific goals in mind. What do you think would be a good way to take CASA more seriously in our domain, in MIR? You also ask it at the end.
Yeah, so I will split in two. First, I didn't meant that people were not, I don't know, smart enough or to go into CASA.
It's a good point. I think it's an important point.
I'm saying that CASA is, people are feeling that it's a dangerous game with not a lot of outputs, like it's hard to evaluate, it's really hard. So people are kind of saying more, we are inspired by ASA, and then we have a specific target, and then we crunch numbers, and we improve the things, and so we get a nice paper. And I'm the first to do it. So I'm in this kind of problem. Like basically, I want to go further, deeper, and I have some problems. So that's my let's say second part, and I maybe would be happy to have some expert ideas maybe. So the question here is more on basically. That is CASA can be defined as a goal. Can you have some kind of, I don't know, psychoacoustical experiment out of, I don't know, machine learning system, that psychoacoustical experiment that would take the output of a machine learning system to maybe show that things are done well, and can it be decomposed into well-defined tasks that we can maybe separately evaluate? So that's kind of, for me, really important questions.
Yeah, so I mean, my perspective on this is that it seems to me part of the reason why there isn't that much work along the lines that you're suggesting is that the technology communities are focused on doing better and better at very particular tasks. So getting a percentage point improvement on some speech recognition competition or something like that, and those are good goals. I think it's probably also important to also do basic research that maybe would be tolerant of not achieving peak levels of performance next year, but might nonetheless yield some insights about eventually how to do much better, right? Because I mean, the problem I think we face is that people are so much better than computers, and we're operating down here trying to get up by a small amount, which again, from the standpoint of building something that works, is important.
So at the moment, we're not at the stage where we can make a link between these two things. Like we still can't harness what we know about auditory scene analysis in order to use it in a final system.
Well, I don't think that's fair. I mean, that's not what I meant to say. I mean, I think it's more just that if you really want to bring biology and technology together, I think the goal has to be of long-term success, rather than some short-term incremental improvement. I mean, the stuff that John is talking about, I do think is really in that direction, in the sense that he's acknowledging that when people do scene analysis, we're not necessarily doing what a source separation algorithm would classically be trying to do, which is simultaneously estimate 5 different things, right? There's one thing we're interested in the foreground, and we don't maybe worry as much about the background. And I mean, that's an area where I think there could be some profitable interplay in terms of actually understanding what people do in fact represent about the background. And he's taking some steps in that direction. But I mean, personally, that's kind of what I'm most passionate about, is trying to go back and forth in that way. It's not easy to do, and so it may not be realistic to suppose that the system will instantly be competitive. But I think in the long run, the dividends will be large. But
adding to that, I think there's some tasks where CASA is almost essential as an approach. So if you're trying to do robust speech recognition, you're just trying to get the best possible speech recognition performance in a given environment, then sure, you can use a million different approaches. But say you want to make a model of speech intelligibility, which might then be used to optimize hearing aid algorithms or to design room acoustics, then you've really got to have a model which transcribes speech in a way which mimics human behavior. So you don't want something working better than humans. You want something that makes the same mistakes, which gets confused at the same time. Which finds the same environments difficult and other environments easy. So if you're going to have that kind of model, then you probably do need to be kind of looking more closely about some of the processing that's going on in the human auditory system. So maybe you want to have And then you're kind of back to square one, where you've got this search space which is as intractable. So, by defining the hard things, we can, we reduce the search space, but it's kind of a case of finding ways where we can reduce the search space without making tough and hard decisions. I mean, one way is that if you're doing things sequentially, the kind of Markov assumptions, is you can search over, you can have like one frame fragments, which have associations with fragments in the next frame. So, you've got a fragment here in this frame, and a fragment here, and this one's more likely to belong to that one, but not necessarily 100% likely to belong to that one. Then you can search through in a kind of sequential way, and as long as you kind of apply Markov assumptions in your language models and in your segmentation models, you can do kind of Viterbi decoding. And you can search through a very large number of possibilities in an efficient manner. So there are kind of efficient ways of representing more complicated grouping models. But it's always, if you want to kind of say that this thing might belong to something long way in the future, or more so or less so, and make kind of links between things which are far apart in time, then you've got a problem as well. But then the question is, do humans do that, or are humans applying very simple kind of probabilistic grouping rules? So you can introduce kind of probabilistic grouping rules into this, but at the possible expense of having a bigger search problem when you come to do the kind of decoding. So there's this kind of balance between trying to keep the model simple and keep things computationally tractable.
So still the basic idea, because if your final goal is to divide all of these different segmentations into two groups, foreground, background. So still the basic approach is to try all possible combinations and to compare them to your model and see how well the model understands this combination?
Yep, that's basically the basic approach, yeah.
And wouldn't there be some way to find coherence between the segments which is unrelated to a final model?
Well, the assumption is that if you pick out bits that don't fit the final model, that you pick out, say this and this is speech, say this and this is speech and that's background. If you picked out that and that as foreground, that spectral combination there simply wouldn't match the models. So, that segmentation will be penalised. It won't score as well as one that does.
And if you don't have a model?
If you don't have a model, then you're stuck. So it's the same in the cat and dog picture. I mean, I can pick out the cat because I've got a model of the cat, and I can see the kind of bands, I can see the fragments. If I pick out the right ones, they match the cat, and that's okay. But if I pick out bits of cat and bits of dog, they don't match. I mean, that analogy is kind of quite a poor analogy in a way, because there's other grouping things going on. You can see kind of continuity across bands and stuff, so there might be other things going on as well. But that's the kind of basic idea, that you are using this kind of top-down information to search through segmentations and looking at ones that are consistent.
Because I was just thinking how this might be applied to music in order to, let's say, track different instruments. We're out of time.
I think that some of the stream formation theories proposed by Bregman, that over time continuity may help to make some sense of those first segmentations. So that is kind of a segregation or formation of these clusters of sounds in periods or simultaneously in time. But then you want to find relations over time between them. So stream formation is in music happens because you have close notes with close frequencies or not very far apart in time or something like that. So maybe some of the proposals by Bregman may help in the case of music.
Large-scale grouping.
Exactly. So you don't have language models for music. Well, you could also apply music theory for specific known types of music, like Western music, classical music. But if you want to keep it to a semantic level a little bit lower without having that prior knowledge, you maybe can use stream formation theories or proposals, which are not perfect and will work in most cases, but at least you have something to try.
I was thinking about the case of music, and the analogy would be to have a model for every possible instrument that you might have in the mixture if you want to compare to your segmentation to final model. And so my question was sort of based on the assumption of, could you do something like this for music, but without the need of having a model for every instrument that you might want to model?
It's not even instrument, it's style of playing, because if you are modeling the speech, you have a default model where you are basically, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but you model the temporal evolution of the different phoneme series. So this would mean that if you would need to encode the way people are actually doing their articulations and things. So it's even more problematic than modeling all the instruments. It's modeling each player. So that's why basically I was really happy to have John to talk, because that's, from my perspective, a really nice probabilistic framework for merging bottom to top process to top to bottom ones, which is basically application driven in a way. And that's something that in music hasn't been done because of those problems. The only thing that we can start, but for example, if we are doing scene analysis for classical pieces, then most of the systems which are highly accurate are the thing that Chun-Sing Ye is doing, like a multi-pitch analysis, which are strictly bottom-up approaches, where he has a lot of he has some priors about timbre informations to resolve overlap, but well, it's far from what in speech you can encode and prior that you can have. But I really think that well, in the brain there is something. Well, basically every result that we have in terms of speech intelligibility or implicit learning scale are symmetric in music. So the work of Barbara Tillman, which is working in Lyon, is the main result is this. Like every experiment that you can do with speech for learning for kids are exactly the same. The outcomes are exactly the same for music. So this means that, well, this doesn't mean that the outcome, the result that she is making, her thesis is that basically there is, it should be the same area in the brain which is responsible, which makes sense because music in a way is a different language, you know. So, but I didn't see any applications in music information retrieval where we could basically really make use of prior knowledge and feed it to this kind of bottom-up approaches that we are all doing for scene analysis. But this needs to be thought more.
Well, there are applications though that pick out. There are applications that will look at a fragment and sort of get an idea of the genre of the music and then make assumptions from there. I mean, that's using top-down.
Yeah, we are trying, but basically, for example, if you're trying to predict the genre, maybe you will say, okay, I will try to segregate things, and things will work better. For my perspective, that doesn't work. For example, I've made a simple experiment where you separate the singer, and then you say, okay, if I can recognize the singer, then maybe I will be able to identify the artist better. In fact, the encoding of the artist is, well, his voice, her voice, but also a lot of, well, the accompaniment, the way it's mixed, because basically he has his sound engineer, which is doing really specific things. So in the background there is also important information that can be used. So basically defining the task is really hard. One of, I guess, you are working on a melody analysis, and I think that maybe some kind of prior might be built, which are maybe simpler, and that could be used. This could be a task that.
Yeah, that's why.
More questions, comments, rants?
Well,
one final one. Okay, so now attention. Let's talk about attention. I know we don't want to go there, but I mean, for example, in your model, would your model in any way be able to do the kind of monitoring that people do for like their name, the classic cocktail party thing? If an unattended voice is speaking your name, how would you make your model able to pick out that?
Well, yeah. Yes. I mean, if you had that task given to you, I mean, you would encode a model which had two states, in parallel, one saying silence, one saying my name, with a loop, and you would put that in as your target model, and you would wait for the time it goes through the, the name state. I mean,
It's pretty high computational cost.
I don't think it's any more than, any kind of keyword spotting in speech recognition is a high computational cost approach. I mean, you're basically having to kind of, I guess, there might be other approaches where you might think, do some speech detection first and then apply the model once you've heard speech. So kind of hierarchical kind of techniques maybe. But you're kind of running this kind of. Well, it's not. I don't think it's that high computational because the models for speech, the model for your name, and the model for silence are quite small models. The state space is quite small. You can construct a model for that. You're running this kind of interpretive decoding kind of in the background. We haven't. I haven't kind of used this framework for that application. There are people who do keyword spotting, but we haven't tried out those tasks. But then so you're kind of loading models in, driven by the task at hand. So you're told to keyword spot, listen for your name. I think that's what's more kind of intriguing is the kind of thing where you're having a conversation with someone else and you're ostensibly doing another task, trying to listen to that person's conversation, but then your name occurs. And at that point, your attention shifts. It's as though you've had this kind of name listening process going on in the background all the time. I don't know how it kind of fits in with my hypothesis that you've always got this foreground and background task. Because I don't see how that's difficult. I don't see how that really, but people seem to be able to do this. You could be attending to one sound source and then your name can kind of trick you. Somebody might shout somebody else's name and you don't pay any attention. They shout your name. And somehow you've understood that name, even though it was in the background, according to the task you thought you were doing. So, I'm not sure. So this kind of strong idea that there's no kind of interpretation of the background is obviously, a strong position, which is probably not realistic. The background is being decoded to some extent.
More questions? We still have time.
So I have one comment that maybe is worth mentioning, which is with regard to some of these kind of big questions. And that is that I think part of the reason why we're kind of in a state where it sort of feels like machine hearing and psychoacoustics have become a little bit detached is because all of the psychoacoustics that was done, that's in the Bregman book, is really done with pretty artificial sounds, so tones and noises. And part of that is because in science it's often useful to start simple. Part of it is because those were signals that were very easy to generate, and so everyone kind of knew how to make them. But when you look at something that, like what John is trying to do, these tasks that are challenges for machine hearing are tasks with real sounds, right? If you actually gave a machine hearing algorithm some of the classic artificial psychoacoustic stimuli, they would be perfect probably, right? Because the signals are clean and simple and so forth. And so I think, one of the things that hearing science needs to do, both to understand really how people do the impressive things that we do and to generate insights that will be relevant to building machine systems, is to confront how people actually hear real-world sounds. And that's difficult because real-world sounds are kind of complicated, and if you're dealing with familiar sounds, well, there's all this top-down knowledge that people can bring into task performance and so forth. But that's something that I think is going to be essential for us to start to do. And one of the things that I'm excited about is actually learning more about the structure of natural sounds and developing generative models that can make things that have that kind of structure, which you can then use as stimuli and experiments to better explore how it is that we segregate complex sounds. And I think that once we actually start to really look more at how humans work with real signals, we will gain some insights that will then be applicable to machine hearing. And we can then look, for instance, at some of the failures of machine hearing on these hard, real sounds, and try to understand, well, how is it that a human actually succeeds in this particular instance? But to do that, we have to get away from tones and noises and start, working with more complicated signals.
And for that respect, don't you think that music can be an interesting thing, because it's basically a language for scene organization, in a way, like not dealing maybe with specific sounds, but the way music is deployed and occupy the time frequency space?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, music is. It's a great example of scene analysis. I mean, I think the thing to be careful of, I was talking with somebody about this at the break, is that it's a stimulus that's kind of engineered to enable people to do really well at scene analysis, right? Or really poorly, depending on what the engineer wants to do, right? But it's a signal where you're intended to be able to feel like you can hear 100 different things at once, right? And probably has some unusual properties, right? I mean, the levels of things are very carefully adjusted, so that you minimize masking and so forth. So it's a great example of scene analysis in action, and I think we can get a lot of insights from it. But we also have to keep in mind that it's not a very natural auditory scene in that respect, also.
Also, to a certain extent, the opposite is true as well. That the orchestra may be trying to sound like one instrument. So I guess there is, if they all start at the same time with a common onset, they're already taking advantage of a lot of the grouping cues that we were going to use to try and separate them, I guess.
Yeah, and certainly you can find instances, like if you listen to Phil Spector recordings, right, the sort of wall of sound thing, where he would introduce all this reverb, and we know, of course, reverb makes segregation difficult, right? And his whole intent was to create a complex timbre that you couldn't really pull apart. So that certainly happens, and we can learn things from that as well.
Well, I mean, the other thing I find out in that respect is that music is, a lot of, particularly, modern techno music is using sounds that have no physical reference. I mean, these things were never generated by a real thing, like all that, what's it called, when you correct the voice, auto-tune voices and things like that. I mean, we're listening to things that never happened before, and I find that a unique challenge for it, in terms of how we correlate those things to what we've experienced in life.
Yeah, and here the target is really emotional response from human, and that's the only way of explaining those sounds. Like I know someone who is doing mastering, and this is purely magic. The way he deals about a drum kick for 2 hours, like embedding a pure tone just inside and merging the things, and this is something that, as you said, is completely departing from physics, and is all purely guided by, wow, this is loud, this is kicking me off, and this is this kind of emotional response that is really guiding him in his sound design.
A very small retaliation about music. I mean, actually, if you compare it, let's say, to speech in a cocktail party, people are probably not going to be saying exactly the same words at exactly the same time. In music, you lose all of these cues that you could use. I mean, the instruments start at the same time; they are harmonically related to each other. So I think actually that's one of the reasons why CASA and music, people are scared to deal with it, is because it's hard.
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. I mean, I'm just sort of referring to the fact that we all have had this experience of listening to a piece of music and really, being able to identify about 10 different things, right? And it's very hard to find a real auditory scene in which that's the case, right? Just because things mask each other, or there aren't that many sources, or whatever, right? But like a really well-engineered recording gives you this impression that you can often hear like 10 or more things, so, and that's unusual for the real world. So
I think on that note as well, speech is a special case too, for different reasons, and because speech is produced to be heard, and a lot of these experiments you kind of mix speech into backgrounds, and the speaker who spoke them was speaking in an acoustic booth in a quiet condition, and you mix them into some noisy background, it might become unintelligible. But in real cocktail parties, people adapt the way they speak in order to be heard. So again, it's artificial in the sense that it's kind of trying to exploit people's auditory systems to make itself easy to be segregated from the background, perhaps. So maybe it's purely natural scenes with no communication, no communication humans in them, basically, because both music and speech are trying to communicate. Whereas these other scenes are kind of just passively out there, trying to interpret them. It's a different kind of...
So maybe this concept of when there's communication involved in the scene, it might be exploited in some way.
Well, for sure. I mean, I think the real problem with understanding speech in real settings is probably easier than some of these artificial problems we're setting up, because there's no Lombard effect, there's no kind of change in the way that people are speaking to make themselves heard. So it's really quite artificial. I mean, in this chime data, we recorded this domestic environment, and then we artificially mixed speech in with reverberation into the environment. And we did it to get a range of SNRs. I mean, some of the places we're mixing in it's competing against children screaming, like right next to the microphones, and there's just no way that someone would even attempt to try and communicate. In that kind, they'd wait until the person stopped screaming, and then, so you've got to be careful avoiding.
Yeah, although I think, by the same token, I mean, there are definitely very common real-world scenarios where understanding somebody talking is pretty difficult. If you're in a noisy restaurant, it really requires all your effort. And if you literally step back by a foot, you lose it. So there are situations where we're really operating on the edge. And then if you have someone with hearing impairment, I mean, they just tune out because they can't even get it, right?
And if it's not your mother tongue, your mother language too.
Yeah.
For example, if time goes by and it's starting to be really late, and if things get really you really have to keep a high focus to be able to follow.
I think that's a good point, that when dealing with speech, there is always kind of an implicit reason that speech is there to be understood by the receiver, or the focus is on really understanding and taking that out of the mixture. In music, traditionally the exercise of orchestration and composing is somewhat not so clear, so things are carefully put together so that you can't, or it's not easy to actually understand, identify the sources, the components that make the overall sound. So the composer mixes the clarinet with the bassoon in order to create a new mass of sound that is, his idea is not it's perceived like a clarinet and a bassoon playing together as a complete new timbre. And so when we try to do that, to try to identify that it's a clarinet and a bassoon playing together, maybe that's what blind source separation or some topics on music information retrieval are doing, because there are some interest in reversing the process. But I'm not really sure that in a CASA approach we are so much interested in that, but more in understanding that in a complete orchestra, maybe the perception of the bassoon and the clarinet playing together is interesting, and is perceived as a sonic entity by itself. So not so much go into the physical sources, but more in the perceptual sources. So that may be one of the reasons why CASA systems do not perform very well in the competitions where actually are made to extract speech or to extract specific physical sources from the signal, and the CASA is not even trying to do that. So that's something that is not very yet clear, but it depends where you are actually targeting it. So
I think that there is an interesting big difference between speech and music, is that in fact they are are different from environmental scene, because they carry an intention, so they have both carry a meaning, but I think it's at a different level, because for speech the meaning is at one channel, so the speech channel, and then if you are able to avoid the remaining, then you're fine, you will be able to understand what the guy is saying, and you won. And for music, I think that the meaning is more at the structural level, so at the way basically the different sources are organized together. And I think it makes a really subtle point, which might request that if you want to understand music and understand how we perceive music, you should not focus on one thing, but more focus on the way things are organized. So I don't know if you agree with this kind of statement.
I mean, I guess the point is there's more than one way of listening to a piece of music, and even the same person, listening again to the same piece can, you can attend to one voice, or you can hear the whole thing kind of as an ensemble. I mean, choosing how you set your attention. Whereas probably there's only one way of correctly listening to speech. You don't try and kind of resolve formants, or you could try to, that would be pointless. So that's perhaps a difference.
And I think it's a real challenge for us in terms of thinking about representation, right? And like, how do you have a hierarchy like that where you can tune into sort of different levels of grouping, and what do you actually represent when you're really attending to the piece as a whole as opposed to an individual voice? We don't really know, but they're very interesting questions.
So one thing I wanted to point out, one difference between music and speech is also that in music, as a listener to music, you are completely passive. You're just listening. With speech, you can actually get closer to the person you're talking to. You can ask for details. You can turn your head. So it's maybe not the same kind of problems. Maybe not to be rude or anything, but maybe the task of separating speech there's something quite academic about it, because maybe humans don't do it in a way. They will be active in their listening. So maybe turn their head, or, as I say, ask for details or whatever.
For sure. I mean, there's a whole kind of untouched research area on kind of, if you like, active or interactive auditory scene analysis. I mean, nearly everything starts from the perspective of a stationary microphone fixed in a room, recording a scene. As soon as you're going to kind of put microphones onto robots, and now you've got the idea of a robot kind of exploring an acoustic scene. You've got some sort of potential audio kind of motor feedback where the thing's got intense, and it can use its motors to drive itself to change the scene around it. I mean, even localization. I mean, trying to localize an object, if you move your head, that makes the localization task much easier. And it changes your whole kind of perception of the acoustic scene. And I don't think many people are doing stuff like this. I mean, I think maybe, they might argue that actually makes the problem more difficult because you haven't sorted out the stationary problem yet. But in a way, it makes the problem easier because it gives you a kind of access to a whole bunch of new approaches where you might, solve the task simply by moving closer to the talker. So, yeah.
There was a strong disagreement.
No, I guess that I wasn't listening carefully enough to the whole story. I think this notion of active listening is a very important one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting how in vision science, the relationship between action and perception has been pursued quite extensively. I mean, if you go back to these old experiments that Held and Hine did with, cats being bussed around in the environment versus actively engaged with the environment and seeing how different their abilities to respond to cues in the environment were developed later, where the active participants did much better. Now, we don't have much work on that in audition. Now, I think, engaging, this idea of engaging with the environment with one's head and sort of poking around, I think is an important thing. I do it all the time at home when I'm trying to figure out where's that noise, from these kinds of activities. So yes, I would agree. But I would also agree that even if one's sitting still, and that's maybe why I shook my head, that one can be active in their listening experience. In other words, entertain various hypotheses about what's going on, and so on, and try them out on the, acoustic residue that might be sitting around in our echoic memories. And so this perceptually active notion. But we haven't been doing much on that. I think it's important to do that. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. And I think the paradigms are going to be a bit hard to develop. But I think there's some good behavioral things that can be done.
Thanks. So I think we reach a really nice conclusion. Thank you. So thank you for attending. Just a short slide. So stay tuned. There will be, hopefully the videos at the workshop will soon be available. So if you know people that might be interested in what has been said this afternoon, just, well, I will send the thing to Auditory and Music IR mailing list anyway. And there will be possibly a continuation of the discussion at the next ISMIR, which will be organized in Porto, Portugal, by Luis Gustavo Martins and Fabien Gouillon. So again, we will keep you posted on the standard ways of communication, which are mailing list. Thank you for.
Thank you all.